Welcome back in. Welcome back, Inspector. Just to confirm, you are live on YouTube.
Thank you. And just resume the inquiry. Can everyone hear me? Yes.
Yes, we
the
can.
Inquiry is resumed. So I've received the written statement, a written closing speech for the appellant, and so I'll hand over to Mr. White.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Before, this is the only time I hope to depart from the text, because as I said yesterday, I've added in a few bits in response to my learned friends. But I did just want to say in introduction, I wanted to just say on behalf of the appellant, could I make 3 thank yous? The first is to the third parties who I know strongly disagree with our case, but the way they behaved, particularly Councillor Crawford and Mr. Poole, has been immaculate. So I do want to thank them for the way they've conducted themselves from our perspective. I also clearly want to thank my learned friends for the LPA, who the same comments apply. And lastly, sir, can I thank you on behalf of the appellants for the way you've conducted the inquiry, and obviously to the flexibility you've shown. And I think we all actually collectively need to be commended for keeping completely to the programme, which is a rare event indeed these days. So thank you on behalf of the appellants. So could I return to the text, please? And I want you, please, in overview, can I make some points in introduction on behalf of Miss Foster and myself? And the first is, we say why permission being granted now is both necessary and urgent. And so the overarching context of this appeal is that there is a recognised national crisis for the provision of housing. This is not some academic or intellectual issue, but affects people now on the ground in real life with real and profound harmful consequences. It is noteworthy that the LPA, in closing, accept the delivery and provision of market and affordable housing is an important issue, and that building new houses is a pressing issue facing our society today. There is a clear difference between the parties in that both accepting that there is a pressing and important issue, but we say the LPA, as encapsulated in their closing, does nothing to address this issue. However, the appellant wants tangible, practical solutions now. The reality, sir, is there is a desperate shortage of housing nationally and locally. This is an authority, Ashford Borough Council, that historically has a housing shortfall, currently has a shortfall, and the credible evidence is that it will continue to have a shortfall for another 5 years. On any basis, it is, and this is just for Miss Goodyear's pleasure, but it is a lamentable performance that can only be remedied not by papers being released, not by the council having meetings, not by the council having discussions and then further consideration, but actually by action. And that action must be constituted by actually granting planning permissions now, which will be delivered. The position here is that if you decide to grant permission, it will result in 141 homes being delivered by one of the leading developers in the UK. And so can I just ask you to reflect? We haven't spent any time on this at the inquiry, but I just want you to ask you to reflect, and maybe even while you're considering this matter, walk around any new housing development and look what you find. Who will actually occupy these houses? Not machines, not robots. They won't be empty. No one contends they'll be empty. What actually will be there are 141 families with children, couples, of course, individuals and children associated, who will be housed in this, what we all, I think, agree is a wonderful location in a beautiful environment with fabulous facilities on their doorstep. You simply couldn't have a better site, frankly. And the inherent merits of this site are being reinforced every single day of this inquiry. If, on the other hand, the site is rejected, then one can only view the future with pessimism and despondency. The housing shortfall will be long-term, harmful and detrimental to the most vulnerable in society. As always, and this is true on every inquiry I do, we've heard from those who live in their own homes close to the site. They wish with some force to keep the status quo. Of course, they have a wonderful standard of living with lovely homes in a wonderful town. Their position is completely understandable, but it is not the objective approach required to meet the housing need that exists. Additionally, and I do reinforce the criticism I made to Miss Goodyear, the LPA, frankly, have been dilatory in their approach to the provision of housing. Not one officer of this council has come before you to address the housing need and what steps are being taken to address the shortfall. Instead, the easy option has been taken, and a consultant based in Dorset comes to provide comfort on the position of this statutory local planning authority in Kent. And I do say it's remarkable. In addition, no timetables provided of any kind of how and when they will have the SPD that sets the roadmap for dealing with Stodmarsh. Even now, in February 2022, the position of this council in relation to the provision of housing is marred in inaction and procrastination. Who is in this authority actually taking housing delivery seriously? Just reflect on that, sir. We say no one, or said to be important by my learned friend in closing, not one officer has come to the largest housing appeal in their district or their borough to answer your questions. Not one member has told you how they believe the housing crisis can be solved. All we have heard is how to stop the delivery of housing. Frankly, the failure of politicians of all political hues in this borough council to grab this issue and take it seriously is appalling. The approach is replicated on the ground here, and therefore there is only one inference to be drawn. The seriousness of this issue is completely ignored by everyone in this authority. That is actually why there is a housing crisis. And my learned friend's closing is the perfect advocate for non-provision. We've had 115 paragraphs, of which one deals with the LPA's consideration of the benefits of the proposal, paragraph 112, and it encapsulates the approach. 140 paragraphs saying no in the context of a massive shortfall, and one paragraph considering the benefits of housing from the LPA perspective. And that is exactly why there is a housing crisis. However, sir, I ask you, turn away from negativity, criticism and problems and think about what could happen if permission is granted. And the planning system must be more ambitious and braver than allowing the status quo to continue. It is tasked by government with significantly boosting the supply of housing and meeting the needs of those in need of housing, particularly those most in need of housing, the vulnerable, the needy and the homeless. This is an incredible opportunity to make the planning system a system that provides meaningful and long-lasting solutions by providing what is needed now in the right place at the right time. So, sir, the appellant proposes up to 141 homes, of which 50% will be affordable, and a country park and sports pitches on a site adjacent to Tenterden, which is agreed to be the second largest settlement in Ashford and the only other town outside Ashford. We emphasise that the appeal comprises three elements, because it is important not to lose sight of this when the overall impacts and benefits of this mixed-use proposal come to be considered. Of course, the opposition has mainly focused on the residential elements. However, the provision of the substantial formal and informal leisure facilities, of course, of about 12 hectares, in the form of a country park and sports facilities, are fundamental elements of the scheme. The homes are proposed to be built on the western side. The country park will be about 8.66 hectares, and then there'll be just over 3 hectares of sports pitches of 5 different types. There will also be the new sports pavilion. The LPA, in summary, have put forward a number of reasons of refusal, but in introduction, we say these objections have been shown to be weak and many concerns have fallen away. First of all, reason of refusal 1 is based on the council's misunderstanding and misapplication of SP1 and SP2. We say that the policies actually support development at accessible and sustainable locations, which the appeal site undoubtedly is. The scale of the proposed development is clearly proportionate to the size of Tenterden, and the quantum of development in the appeal proposal in Tenterden in no way harms the spatial strategy articulated in the plan. We say the proposal does not result in any breach of SP1 and SP2, and in any event, those policies are failing to deliver enough housing, resulting in a significant shortfall. Secondly, we deal with the minor and highly localised landscape and visual harm. This level of harm is incredibly light for a greenfield site and is inevitable in any greenfield development. This must be seen in the context that the LPA accepts the need to develop on greenfield sites given the urgent need for housing in the borough through both allocations and windfalls. Thirdly, we deal with the one tree loss on the avenue, which we say won't change the overall character of the avenue, and where many trees, I think the number is 39, have already been lost or removed in places. Also, the LPA failed to consider the vast improvement that will be made by planting replacements and additions to the current position. Fourthly, we deal with the deterioration of one tree, the T381, but without any substantive explanation or quantification as to how and why harm will actually be caused. In reality, as Mr. Jones set out, there will be no deterioration. Fifthly, we say there's a completely unjustified and flimsy assertion relating to ecological improvements. Sixthly is dealt with now by the satisfactory conclusion of a 106 agreement. Seventh has gone. 8 relies on a potential right-of-way yet to be confirmed. We say it's simply not a relevant consideration for this appeal. And even if it is, the public right-of-way can be accommodated within the proposed development. And again, ninthly has been satisfied. So on a fair view, we say the remaining concerns are not weighty and meaningful grounds of objection, but make weights and seeking to justify the refusal. We also say the LPA has shown a lack of objectivity in forming many of these reasons of refusal and continuing to pursue them. The LPA need to show, in the light of their concession that the tilted balance does apply, that the remaining alleged impacts significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits. And as we said in opening, sir, this is a heavy and onerous burden. The evidence that this inquiry has shown that those impacts are actually not adverse at all. The most the LPA can realistically rely on is the inevitable localised impact from building housing on a greenfield site and the loss of a single avenue tree. My learned friend's closing speech on behalf of the LPA is revelatory. It can be seen that what they actually only really believe is that one harm is portrayed by the end of the closing, where specific and express emphasis is only placed on harm to countryside and the landscape setting of Tenterden in conclusion at para 113. So, in introduction, sir, the overarching point we seek to make is the benefits of the scheme are substantial and weighty, and the impacts come nowhere close to significantly and demonstrably outweighing the benefits. Now, sir, can we adopt the propositions Ms. Foster put in opening? First of all, the government's overarching aim for the planning system is to see a significant boost to the supply of housing. The government have, and again, so please focus on the wording in the NPPF, the government have the clearest objective, which is to significantly boost the supply of homes. And that does require contemplation. The government have adopted that as an objective. That objective is academic unless real and concrete steps are taken to achieve it. It can be achieved by bringing forward sufficient amount and variety of land where it is needed, that the needs of specific housing requirements are addressed, and that land with permission is developed without unnecessary delay. We say this proposal will meet all three of those initiatives in meeting the overarching objective. This is not a policy that is speculative or recent. Since March 2012, the government has decided, after much thought and political discussion, that housing need, unlike, for example, traffic need, should be met through the planning system. And as we know, the planning system seeks and needs to provide 300,000 houses per annum. The planning system needs to meet the identified need here in Ashford Borough Council. That need is huge and must not and cannot be ignored. So secondly, let's focus what's actually happening in this Borough Council. We say that there is a massive requirement for housing now in the next 5 years. The agreed need and requirement is for 7,195 units. And again, so just spend a moment to reflect on that. Imagine lining up 7,195 units. And the context, of course, as I've said previously, Tenterden's about 3,900. So you've almost got to build 2 Tentertons in the next 5 years in this borough council. That target would be huge for an urban authority, let alone a rural authority in Kent. The council accept without any issue they cannot demonstrate a 5-year supply of housing. The only matter in dispute is the extent of the shortfall. We say the requirement for that number of units is subject to one point, which is, of course, the relevant base date and the missing 3 months, but it's also made up of 3 parts: the annual requirement of 888 units, the backlog and the buffer. The minimum requirement of 888 is a significant requirement. Then the backlog, and again, just think about this in the context of Tenterden. So the backlog identified by the council, 2,412 units. Again, that would be a town on its own, which have not been built by this council. And again, it's nearly 3 years of the requirement. Then we have the buffer. So the requirement, adding those 3 parts together, we now have an agreed requirement of 1,439 homes, which is now therefore significantly in excess of the LPA requirement established 3 years ago. It is the clearest manifestation that the local plan is not working when within 3 years of its adoption, the requirement so exceeds what's set out in the development plan. Now, the LPA have sought consistently, and again, we had that this morning, to reduce the sense of urgency in crisis by seeking to reassure you, as was done in opening, and this seems to be the mantra, that it will be short-lived and small. Don't worry, the shortfall is short-lived and small, but that is mere words. There is no evidence that's actually the case for the following reasons. Firstly, there is this very contradictory position that Mr. Howell Williams tells you that 141 units is so large that it will threaten the spatial strategy, as we've heard this morning. And yet, in the context of the debate, when you look at the shortfall, the LPA seek to marginalise and minimise 664 unit shortfall as small. Secondly, there is actually no evidence that the shortfall will be short-lived. In fact, as Mr. Taylor articulated last week, it's getting worse. When your colleague, the inspector into the local plan, looked at it, in the EIP report, he concluded that it was 5.3 years in 2018. Then in 2019, it was 5.12 years, so just in the positive. Then 20, 4.8, now 4.54 years. So thus, in the past 4 years, we don't have a position of happiness, but of decline. That is a shortfall that is created, that's been created, and is worsening and deepening. So since the adoption of the local plan and the great love-in to SB2 that Mr. Howell Williams has articulated this morning, the council simply have not delivered the homes SB2 required or assumed, nor the housing that the local plan trajectory assumed. The LPA have now known, and except for at least 16 months, they cannot demonstrate a 5-year land supply, and in all probability that period was longer, and yet they have done absolutely nothing to close the gap. There is not, unlike other authorities, any interim policy. There's no interim plan to deal with a worsening crisis. Instead, what you have seen in the starkest terms is the ostrich approach encapsulated by Miss Goodyear's evidence and by my learned friend's cross-examination of Mr. Ross, and actually articulated in the closing that everything's working beautifully and full weight should be given to SB2. But so you will know it's completely the opposite of what the government want to happen. If a policy is failing, then it needs to be reassessed and reevaluated. That is exactly what paragraph 11D of the NPPF seeks to do by deeming policies out of date so that permissions can be granted now. Of course, we also have the argy-bargy about the 5-year period. The justification offered by the council was patently inadequate to justify this inconsistency. As a point of honest, accurate and transparent accounting, the arid maths problem Mr. Taylor talked about, the 5-year requirement shortfall should relate to the monitoring year of April to March. Otherwise, you create a missing 3 months in the calculation, which it must do. The consequences of the missing 3 months is it can only make things better for the LPA's benefit. It does not include the 222 homes of the accumulated target in those 3 months, which must be added to the past shortfall if a 1st of July position is used as the LPA suggests. In terms of supply, the MPPF and Annex 2 could not be clearer. Category B sites should only be considered, and just think about the emphasis there, sir, should only be considered deliverable where there is clear evidence that housing completions will be begun on site within 5 years. Clear evidence as a test requires evidence has to be robust, up to date, assumptions need to be realistic, and any material relied upon has to have evidential value. It is therefore incumbent on an LPA to show clear evidence to justify the inclusion of any site as deliverable. And so that nettle was completely grasped by Inspector Stevens in the Allfold appeal. The Borough Council frankly relies on many Category B sites and future windfalls that require mitigation relating to Stodmarsh nutrients issue. That mitigation is a long way from being finalised. This mitigation will require significant areas of wetlands that needs to be identified before the grant of permission, and secondly, will need to be constructed and well established over growing seasons before homes can ultimately be completed and occupied. The LPA simply have not provided evidence, let alone it being clear, which shows progress towards implementation of that mitigation to allow the sites to come forward beyond a mere asserted timetable. No updates being provided to this inquiry on the wetland site acquisition necessary, which should have frankly already occurred. The LPA can provide no evidence as to how and when the SPD is being progressed, so reflect on your questions to Miss Goodyear on this matter. Despite it, we're told it's due to be adopted in mid-22, but it was highly pertinent and revealing that Miss Goodyear could not provide any timetable to the inquiry for its production. Where is it? When will it be provided? One can only speculate, as we have no definitive provision of that. Therefore, sir, the only conclusion we say you can reach is you have no evidence that the wetland mitigation strategy is remotely achievable at the scale necessary and in the timescale set out. Every month that passes, the shortfall gets worse. Further, the LPA provide no evidence on a site-by-site basis as to how the sites will be delivered and when. Ms Goodyear placed huge reliance on second-hand account discussions held with developers. That's simply not clear evidence. In contrast, Mr. Taylor in his Appendix 2 shows that the lack of progress is patently clear on a site-by-site basis. We say, therefore, those sites should be removed. They're not justified for inclusion because they don't meet the MPPG requirements, and therefore we commend Mr. Taylor's scenario 1 to you, which means the LPA has a terrible supply position of 2.75 years and a vast additional shortfall of 3,236 homes looking forward. Even if mitigation with Stodmarsh was to come forward, it is inevitable there'd be delays. That's Mr. Taylor's scenario 2, which would result in a housing supply of 3.57 years and a shortfall of a significant 2,061 homes. There's finally no evidence that Tent 1B will come forward based on the lukewarm letters from the agent. Still, no real timetable is provided, no timetable for the application, its grant and construction, and it must be right to conclude that there's not any certainty on its delivery. So to summarise the housing land position in Ashford Borough Council, accepted there is a shortfall. No compliance with the fundamental requirement of government policy in Para 74 of the MPPF, which is not discretionary, mandatory, namely that the LPA should identify and update annually a supply of specific deliverable sites sufficient to provide a minimum of 5 years' worth of housing. That failure And so can I really emphasize this to you? That failure must have consequences. Otherwise, there's no incentive or penalty for non-compliance. Why does it matter to Ashford if you were to conclude it doesn't matter? The failure must have consequences. The most important policies must be deemed out of date, and rationally, full weight cannot be given to the spatial policies that have failed so patently to deliver sufficient housing. It is therefore our strong position that the position here is less than 3 years' supply, and that requires only one thing in those circumstances: additional windfalls coming forward now. Can I then move on to the third proposition, which is to deal with the benefits? And we say, as explained by Mr. Ross, that this proposal will bring forward substantial and weighty benefits. The first, of course, is market housing. And in the light of what I've just said, no one can be in any doubt about the weight to be given to that benefit. In the light of the government's imperative to boost the supply of housing and taking into account the LPA's worsening housing land supply position, this benefit should be given significant weight. Secondly, affordable housing of the appropriate mix. 50% provided, which exceeds policy requirement and far exceeds the delivery of affordable housing in previous developments in the borough, which, as I dealt with Miss Goodyear, equates to about 15% of total homes delivered in 2021. Mr. Ross again explained his view this benefit should be given more than significant weight. The third benefit, which is a remarkable one, is the provision of a significant country park. This really is a sizable benefit to the whole community who have no lawful access to the land currently. Even if AB 70 was to be confirmed, the country park will provide an improvement far and away better than the public accessing the new footpath, which would afford, and the prospect of AB 70 being confirmed, just simply not justify any reduction in the weight being given to this. Again, this benefit should get significant weight. Then the provision of the sports facilities, significant weight. As will be addressed further, there's an accepted need for sports facilities in Tenterden, and the sports facilities provided by the appeal scheme are ideal to meet those requirements. Again, significant weight. Then the avoidance of other harmful effects. And it's interesting, so I just make an aside. I break my habit of not making an aside, but it's noteworthy how Mr. Howell Williams and Miss Goodyear would not accept this was a benefit, and yet you see the level to which they comment on what they allege are harmful effects in relation to this site. But we say, whilst the avoidance of other harmful effects may not usually be given weight, the particular circumstances here do justify it. The urgent need for housing means that housing will need to be delivered somewhere. This site avoids the harms of Stodmarsh and is in an ideal location, which is not in the context of Tenterden in the OMB, and is accepted not to cause any harm to the OMB, which was the reason given for limited new development in Tenterden in the local plan. We say this should be given moderate weight. The economic benefits. When you consider the employment and investment with building out the permission, the long-term benefits of the increased jobs and increased local spend, again, significant weight. The benefit that this increased local spend will bring is reinforced when one considers the number of vacant units that you would have seen yesterday in Tenterden. Then the environment benefits, the biodiversity benefits that Mr. Goodwin set out. And also, as Mr. Smith explained, there'll be landscape benefits. So we say those should be given limited weight. Then Mr. Maynard, in relation to reduction in the surface water leaving the site, positive drainage strategy and the reduction of flood risk, significant weight. Social benefits from the housing, sports facilities and open space should be given some weight. Finally, the highway enhancements, which we say go beyond the mitigation of the scheme, including speed reductions on Appledore Road and the safer crossing route of Woodchurch Road, should be afforded limited weight. Cumulatively, sir, those matters require significant weight to be attached to them. We also take the view that adding the benefits up cumulatively is a completely valid and appropriate exercise, as shown by your colleague inspectors at Oakley and Leybourne, notwithstanding Miss Goodyear's refusal to partake in such an exercise. And so could I just deal with the matters not in dispute very briefly, but it is relevant when you're considering a site for housing that there's no issue relating to air quality, noise, residential amenity within the site or to those who live next to the site, flooding and drainage, sustainability, highway safety and capacity, archaeology, heritage, loss of agricultural land, housing mix and open space provision. Moreover, as we've already mentioned, the amount of agreement has increased throughout the inquiry, with the concerns in a number of reasons of refusal, such as 6 and 9 being met, as well as parts of reason of refusal 4 and all of 7 being withdrawn. So can I then move on to deal substantively with the battleground on the specific reasons of refusal? And the first is SP1 and SP2. So we say that the allegation, independently of consideration of it, is ambitious on its face when you look at the scale of what we're proposing. And just reflect on that for a moment, sir, because the allegation is, and it would be ambitious in relation to any proposal, but here, a proposal for 141 units is said to harm the spatial strategy set out in the development plan. And again, so can I just ask you to contemplate on what a spatial strategy is? And I don't think there can be any disagreement. A spatial strategy seeks to indicate where development should be placed during the life of the plan period. It is our strong view that the allegation is without foundation for the following factors. Factor 1, that firstly, of course, the spatial strategy, we say, must have reduced weight when it is failing and not providing enough housing. It is ironic, as I've said, that the LPA identify harm to a spatial strategy which has failed throughout its life. Not once since February 2019 has this spatial strategy worked and met the housing requirement set out in the local plan. The second factor is SB1 is not and will never be a development management policy. It sets out broad principles which the LPA intend to seek compliance with, and that is all it does. The third factor is that the only real requirement of SB1 is to focus development on accessible and sustainable locations wherever possible. So even that requirement is not mandatory, but however, it is complied with as accepted by Ms. Goodyear in cross-examination. Fourthly, and this is the absolute nub of the point, on a fair and reasonable reading, it simply does not support a contention that all housing must be in Ashford. This is not what the policy says or even intended. There is explicit acceptance that the rural areas will take a share of housing as reflected in HOU 5. It's also agreed by Ms. Goodyear that HOU 5 criteria A to D is met, and therefore the LPA's position is that the site is an accessible and sustainable location. The sixth factor is there is no wording in either policy which requires any site to be the most sustainable or accessible, and some kind of quasi-sequential approach to considering such matters should be implied into, as it appeared to be developed by Mr. Howell Williams. This purely seeks to bolster a weak case, but nothing more. It is also revelatory that nowhere has the LPA shown a comparative approach to any other application for windfall development, showing that it is the most sustainable. Factor 7, it's agreed without hesitation that Tenterden is the second largest and sustainable development in Ashford Borough Council. As we've said previously, it's now got nearly 9,000 residents, nearly 4,000 properties, so its expansion by 141 units would be proportionate and acceptable. And you can cross-check that by the LPA's decision in the plan to allocate 225 units at Tent B, and the judgment must have been reached that that level of housing was proportionate, acceptable and sustainable. Also, Tilden Gill was not considered a windfall in the local plan. Paragraph 16 of my learned friend's closing is wrong. It was an extant permission, and you can see that from the local plan appendix 5. So in any event, bringing it all together to contend that a development that's materially smaller than Tent 1B would not be proportionate is not credible. Then can we deal with probably the strongest factor, sir, and that is SB2 being out of date, which is the agreed position. Everyone agrees it's out of date. This is a policy that should have delivered 1,240 new homes per annum since 2018, but has actually delivered 2,714 homes cumulatively against the requirement of 3,720. Therefore, the policy's only provided 73% of the housing it should have in its first 3 years. Just reflect on that, sir, particularly in the context of full weight. We say 73% of its target means, frankly, it's failing. It also, and it is putting it quite high, but frankly, it's fair. Something that only achieves 73% is a pretty hopeless policy. It only has one job, which is to ensure provision of enough housing. And by any criteria or assessment, it has been and will continue to be a disaster. 73% of its target. It does not do what it should do. If a strategy is failing, then the starting point must be to reduce weight. It is, frankly, genuinely remarkable that the LPA, both in their planning evidence and closing, ask you to give full weight to a policy which is failing by common consent and agreement. Of course, and I make this very clear, sir, in law, it is open to you, as it is to Miss Goodyear, to conclude full weight can be applied to it. But we do say that would be a bizarre judgment, an exercise of your planning judgment, because it would completely neutralise the effects of Para 11 of the NPPF, when the government clearly want weight to be reduced in most, if not all cases, to policies that are the most important, if there's not a 5-year land supply. In the Goodyear world, and applying her doctrine, not having a 5-year housing land supply has absolutely no effect whatsoever on the approach to the most important policies, which, like in this case, are then deployed by her with full weight and used to justify refusing housing, which is trying to meet the shortfall. The consequence would be the shortfall would simply never be addressed in the Goodyear approach. In contrast, we say the real aim of government is quite clearly to make it materially easier to get housing permissions if there is non-compliance with the 5-year position, as recognised by your colleagues who sat in the Oakley and Leybourne decisions, Inspector Jordan and the other inspector, of course, I've forgotten his name, double-barreled landscape inspector. Someone will shout, but yeah, I'm sure you know of him. Now, so, sir, do not be seduced by the argument that the policies are different in those cases. In detail, of course, but intent, no. They are housing strategy policies in those two cases, found to be out of date by reason of non-compliance with a 5-year requirement, and therefore the weight must be reduced to them. And as I say, sir, just reflect on this. If you endorse the approach of the LPA, how does one ever meet a shortfall? How would you meet it in the cases where full weight's given to restrictive policies deployed to refuse housing windfall applications, as the LPA seek to do here? It would never be met, frankly. In contrast, in the 9th factor, we say the requirement, actually SB2 allows the requirement to be met in 3 ways: committed sites, allocations and windfalls. In terms, it allows windfalls. It was common ground, you'll recall me asking Miss Goodyear this in cross-examination, accepted by her in evidence expressly this is a windfall. It's also in the overarching statement of common ground in both the NPPF and development plan terms. How it can then be suggested that site is contrary to the spatial strategy when that is accepted, again, is mystifying and utterly illogical. The key component of the spatial strategy, windfalls, is currently dormant because of Stodmarsh. No windfalls have been granted in Ashford since July 2020, and none can be granted until the SPD dealing with Stodmarsh emerges and Natural England have given their full sign-off. The 11th factor, and this is really important, what the policy actually requires, and please think about this, sir, when you're thinking about Mr. Al Williams's submissions, is that the majority of development be in Ashford. Miss Goodyear accepted that was 51% and above. That is what the policy actually requires. It's therefore really surprising that the LPA closed on the basis that contention should be rejected out of hand, as said in paragraph 9. you must reject the determination of Mr. Al Williams to impose a much higher percentage into the policy. It is simply not there on its terms, but has not been stated to be there in one planning officer's report we have seen or any appeal decision. It has no basis and no precedent of any kind for that clause to be added beyond the majority. The agreed position also is that when one considers commitments and allocations and windfalls, as Mr. Ross set out, 75% of new housing is going to be in Ashford and its surrounds. So even if you impose the gloss that's sought by the LPA at this appeal, it wouldn't lead to any breach of the policy on their terms. And the test of whether windfall is appropriate is set out in terms in SP2, which requires consistency with the spatial strategy and consistency with other policies. We say, for the reasons stated above, we are overwhelmingly compliant with the spatial strategy and also consistent, most importantly, with HOU 5. Therefore, sir, bringing this together, the provision of a housing development in the second most sustainable location in the borough is completely compatible with SP1 and a windfall scheme of appropriate scale in a sustainable and accessible location, and that would wholly comply with SP2. So we ask you to reject the contention there would be harm to the spatial strategy. But finally, in conclusion on this point, do reflect on what is the harm that would occur if you were to, even if you endorse the concerns of the LPA. It is noteworthy that the only spatial policy harm alleged is it would reduce the intended focus on Ashford. That's what's said in para 21 of my learned friend's closing. But that is completely and simply wrong. It would not. It would mean a tiny percentage, just over 1% of housing diverted from the main settlement to the second main settlement, with still 75% of the housing being in the main settlement. So when we bring it all together, sir, this is a wholly artificial and empty concern, frankly, and yet again should never, ever have been contended by the LPA. It isn't a credible ground of objection when one actually properly scrutinises the policy themselves. So now, sir, can I take you back to yesterday and what you saw with your eyes and consider the landscape and visual impacts? And let's start on some happy ground, which is the level of agreement. No landscape designation, no allegation in any harm to the A and B or the conservation area. Also, agreement on the methodology. Also, broad agreement with Mr. Smith's judgments. Do you recall when I took Mr. Withicombe through Mr. Smith's Appendix D and E in the LVIA? Therefore, I say, when you look at what Mr. Smith's judgments are, and I'm sorry, I keep on adding to your burden by asking you to go back and look at things, but do just reflect on Appendix D and E of the LVIA, and particularly tables D4 and E3, and look at what's actually concluded. Mr. Al Williams tries to say that those are serious impacts. We just don't accept that. We say when you look at them, they cannot properly be contended that the harm would be serious. The level of harm simply don't justify those conclusions. Both witnesses accept that the landscape and visual impacts are restricted to the appeal site itself and its immediate locality. Therefore, the closing of the LPA needs clarification in para 25. What actually the harm is, it would harm the site and that which lies within 100 metres of the site. That is the critical and accurate clarification. Mr. Smith takes the view that all greenfield development will result in at least localised landscape and visual harm, and Mr. Withicombe agrees that this will often be the case, subject to his riders and his rebuttal and proof. The difference effectively lies in how their judgments are interpreted and applied in assessing overall effect. It is Mr. Smith's expert evidence and his overall judgments that we say should be preferred, because, of course, he's the only witness before this inquiry to carry out a Glivia-compliant assessment. Mr. Withicombe has no methodology, assessment or process which is in any way comparative, and therefore must be given less weight when the opposite view is supported by a Glivia-compliant assessment. We also take the view that Mr. Smith was a reliable and credible witness. He fairly explained his advice to the appellant that he would not support the previous larger proposal, and he advised a number of changes be made to produce the current scheme. Importantly, the appellant conscientiously listened to him And the result you have before you, sir, is a landscape-led appeal scheme, which Mr. Smith was able to strongly influence, together with a multidisciplinary team, which included the architects, the ecologist, Mr. Goodwin, and Miss Stoughton, the heritage expert. The appeal site is one of the few areas around Tenterden, you'll remember that map in the local plan, which isn't constrained by landscape-related designations. Mr. Smith explained the condition and character of the appeal site varies. He acknowledged that the eastern part of the site has little influence on the existing settlement edge of Tenterden, but he noted that the site is contained by a low ridge on the east, which limits visibility on the site. The rural character and condition of the site materially diminishes at the western part, which is enclosed by the settlement edge on two sites and is influenced by views of houses, garden boundaries, and by lighting and noise. The nature of this boundary in the western part of the site, which comprises fences and vegetation at the rear properties with no formal public access, does not currently contribute to the setting of Tenterden positively, and the contribution of the scenic quality of the appeal site towards the setting of the settlement clearly reduces at the west of the site. The proposed new homes would be located within this western area, where there was already a clear sense of being on this settlement edge. The master plan for the scheme, which Mr. Smith was integral in designing, assisted by three-dimensional computer modelling, ensures that the design of the massing is appropriate in relation to this settlement edge. The master plan is focused on conserving and enhancing landscape character and views, including ensuring that key views towards St Mildred's from footpath AB12 can be retained. Mr. Smith explained the proposed master plan would result in an attractive, safe and distinctive place for future residents to live. The location of development within the site, together with this master plan, means that the landscape character effects of the development are overall minimal and the visual effects will be localised and contained. As mentioned above, Mr. Withycombe broadly agreed with Mr. Smith's judgment on landscape and visual impacts of the scheme within the LVA, namely, of the 12 landscape receptors, there are only 2 categorised as a major moderate negative effect, which are the highly localised receptors, the pasture fields at the western end and the character sub-area at the western end of the site. It is accepted some views towards St Mildred's would be screened, resulting in a moderate negative effect, but many views will still be retained due to the broad greenways and open spaces within the development. There would also be positive effects for the eastern part of the site and the hedgerow network. As to visual receptors, the highest level of visual effect will be on users of footpath AB12 and residents immediately adjacent to the site, though for many residents the negative effects will reduce over time. The visual effects would be highly localised, in particular as illustrated by the ZTV. So as is common ground between the witnesses, as I've said previously, all greenfield developments will inevitably result in at least localised landscape and visual harm, subject to Mr. Withycombe's 2 exceptions. The council accepts it does not have a 5-year supply, and on that basis it will be necessary to develop greenfield sites in Ashford. This puts Mr. Withycombe's position into context, which he describes as an in-principle objection to development on the site and a need to go back to the drawing board. Once you acknowledge that greenfield is required, you could not get a better greenfield site for development than the appeal site. It's one of the few areas not constrained. It's also, as the appeal scheme involves development, the agreed audit of landscape and visual effects above are highly localised, and we say incredibly light. There'd be no effect on the wider landscape and no significant effects on the OMB. We say it would conserve and enhance the setting in compliance with HO5, SB1, SB6 and ENV3A, providing a more permeable edge to the settlement, good informal surveillance across open spaces and greenways, and increasing recreational access to the site and retaining and incorporating key features of the local landscape into the proposal. Therefore, sir, we do say the highly localised landscape and visual impacts do not justify refusal, should be given little weight in the planning balance. Then let's deal with T43. And of course, it's required to put the access in. And it's also Mr. Jones's position. And remember, he told you, sir, that there was an assessment of where to put the access with Mr. Marshall. And his conclusion was that this was the least harmful position. This is important context to properly assess the effect of the loss of this single avenue tree, both in terms of its arboricultural impact and landscape and visual impact. Mr. Jones explained that on examination of the history of the avenue over time, the cohesion of the trees, and no doubt you saw this and had a look at it yesterday, has been eroded, with trees in places having been lost or removed, which creates gaps in the pairings. There were originally 84 trees. There are now only 49. And the 42 pairs of trees, only 13 now remain complete and 6 pairs are absent. Incidentally, the section of avenue where T43 is being removed is an area of relatively denser tree cover, meaning T43 is viewed in the context of a number of other trees of comparable and slightly greater height. Indeed, it is one of the least visible trees on the avenue. Finally, Mr. Smith also explained that the character of the treescape is one of a suburban streetscape fronted by 20th century housing with signage and street lighting, together with trees at irregular centres and of differing species, ages and conditions. So taking all of this into account, Mr. Jones' evidence was that T43 is not a vital component of this already fragmented avenue feature, and its removal will not adversely affect its already reduced uniformity and cohesion. This is particularly so given the location of T43 means its removal will be less noticeable. Mr. Jones noted that the making of a TPO does not itself add value to T43, though he reasonably questioned the legitimacy of the council's approach in having allowed the loss of a great number of trees on the avenue already, and yet imposing a TPO in the lead up to this appeal. Moreover, Mr. Jones explained that the proposed mitigation will more than make up for the loss of this single tree. The appellant has agreed to pay £35,000 to Kent County Council, which is a substantial amount. While there may be no requirement on KCC to spend this on replacement trees close to T43, the correspondence with Kent County Council indicates that their intention would be to spend this sum on replacement trees in the vicinity. Mr. Jones recorded that this sum equated to the establishment and management of 34 or 35 trees. Added to this is also the planting of the new community orchards, the country park, and the planting of many trees across the site. Taken together, these substantial arboricultural gains, we say, far outweigh the impact resulting from the loss of one avenue tree. As to the landscape and visual effects on the street and wider area, Mr. Smith similarly expressed that the loss of T43 would be from an irregular pattern of trees seen in the setting of a 20th century streetscape. He recognised that in landscape and visual terms, there would be a localised minor and negative effect, but this would not change the overall balanced character of views along Appledore Road, particularly when viewed sequentially. On this basis, the character of the streetscape could be conserved. He also noted that the caveat value payment could be used to re-establish most of the missing trees along Appledore Road, even on the basis of conservative growth rates, which Mr. Withercombe did not dispute. Such trees would become a positive feature in the street scene at a relatively early stage. It follows that in relation to both arboriculture and landscape visual matters, the character of the streetscape would be conserved and the distinctiveness and sense of place would not fundamentally change in accordance with policies SP1, SP6, and as set out in policy ENV 3A. The proposals would demonstrate particular regard to the pattern and composition of the avenue trees on Appledore Road. The loss of this tree does not justify refusal of permission and should be afforded little weight in the planning balance. Could I then move on to the 8th proposition? There will not be any material harm to T381, reason of refusal 4. Now, the clear evidence of Mr. Jones following extensive and thorough assessment was that the location of the sports pitch will not result in deterioration of this tree, let alone its loss. It is noteworthy that in closing, the LPA alleged the proposal will lead to its loss, but that simply doesn't reflect the evidence, we say. This is entirely consistent with the LPA's own position. Remember their position, sir, just a year ago, 18 months ago, on the previous 250 unit, where the LPA didn't raise this issue as a concern, even though the proposed relationship was identical. Mr. Jones explained that the British Standard root protection area and veteran tree buffers are layout design tools to help in assessing how close proposed development might be sited to existing trees without the necessity of having to carry out extensive root investigation works. They are a starting point, not the end point. He explained that the correct approach is not to consider how close development can be sited to a tree to avoid deterioration on the basis of design tools that only predict the possible route extents if route investigation works are provided clear, ignoring evidence of the actual route distribution and density. Government guidance recognises that the site, size and type of buffer zones should vary according to the scale, type and impact of the development. In order to test whether the one-size-fits-all route protection area and veteran tree buffer are appropriate with regard to T381, Mr. Jones and his colleagues undertook extensive route and soil investigations, including soil testing, digging trial pits and ground radar surveys to determine the actual locational route distribution and density of T381 and its relationship to the proposed sports pitches. These investigations show that the routes are asymmetrical, extending predominantly north and south, and on this basis it is clear that the RPA and veteran tree buffer should be morphed to accurately reflect this. Following this, Mr. Jones then assessed the impact of construction of the sports pitch and the use of the sports pitch, and it would not lead to harm or deterioration to the tree. There won't be any root severance. No excavation is proposed other than the removal of the existing turf, and there will not be any construction buildings or areas of hard standing. The compaction caused by mowing, which can be done with light machines, would be no greater than tractors, which could be used currently, and the footfall of spectators would not be materially different from the compaction caused by sheep on the fields over recent times. This evidence clearly demonstrates there is no risk of harm to the tree and certainly no deterioration. In contrast to Mr. Jones' thorough and pragmatic evidence, Mr. Cook alleged the harm would be caused to T381, but we say he didn't come up with any substantive explanation as to how exactly the harm would be caused. He relied on compaction from spectators and mowing. However, for reasons given by Mr. Jones, this does not stand up to scrutiny. Mr. Cook appeared to place reliance on the standards, ignoring the consequences of the sound evidence of what the actual route distribution and density is here. When pressed in the roundtable session, Mr. Cook accepted it was difficult for him to quantify why this would actually result in harm. In reality, this is the very highest the LPA could put their case on this issue, and we say is nowhere near sufficient to properly allege deterioration. We say, therefore, there is no deterioration of an irreplaceable habitat and no harm to the visual character of the areas alleged in the fourth reason of refusal, and this does not amount to any material objection against the appeal scheme. Moreover, the LPA does not appear to be convincingly contending that there is loss or deterioration of an irreplaceable habitat as per Para 180 of the MPPF. That was based on Miss Goodyear's. She answered me, so you'll recall in cross-examination, she made no allegation the tilted balance was disapplied for any reason. Mr. Ross took that up. I'm reading from footnote 27 and stated in examination chief that he understood the LPA was not alleging that Para 180C of the MPPF was engaged in this appeal, and he certainly wasn't challenged by Mr. Howard Williams on that point. So we had Goodyear confirmed with me, Ross in chief, and then not challenging cross-examination. However, there does seem to be a slight inconsistency because it's contended now in the LPA's closing that 180C is breached, paragraph 69. However, it's completely bizarre, frankly, because there's no attempt. It's contended 180C is breached. We know what footnote 7 says, and yet there's no attempt in closing to assert the tilted balance should be disengaged. Frankly, sir, the position of the LPA on this matter is baffling, confusing, and inconsistent. We say, forget what Mr. Al Williams, Miss Graham Paul says in closing, the clearest position was articulated by Miss Goodyear in evidence that the tilted balance was in operation. And again, no attempt was made to challenge Mr. Ross on that point. It follows that properly looking at the evidence rather than closing submissions, it can be said legitimately the LPA is right not to pursue this argument that the tilted balance is effectively not disengaged. But we also say there would be no loss or deterioration of the irreplaceable habitat, as Mr. Jones said to you. So can I then deal with ecology? And again, in the strongest way, sir, I start by saying frankly, this is a reason of refusal that should never have been imposed or continued with. It was utterly without justification, and its weakness was completely betrayed by Miss Forster in cross-examination. You'll remember that final period of cross-examination when, in my judgment, she came within an inch of giving it up when I was pressing her on what she said the loss would actually be on biodiversity. And it became clear it's simply not justified. In any event, the contention's so narrow and speculative that the proposed ecological mitigation will not be delivered, again reiterated in the LPA's closing. But on an objective level, forget this site, it's very peculiar because Miss Forster, one of the ecology officers of Kent County Council, was not able to identify for you anywhere else in Kent where this concern was in reality one that had come to pass. Where have you heard of any development being implemented and the ecological mitigation not being carried out as forecast? There was not one case where the ecological mitigation has not been delivered in the way proposed in one single planning application. There is therefore simply no history of any kind or evidence of any issue of this nature across the county. Then we come to the site. It's also peculiar, taking into account the site's characteristics itself. There's no real concrete evidence as to why this might happen. This is a site with no designation whatsoever for ecology, not even on a local level as accepted by Ms Forster. Based on the recognised ecological hierarchy in national government guidance, looking at international sites, national sites, regional, and then local, the appeal site sits at the lowest level of ecological interest, i.e. site level only. There's also much agreement between the appellant and the LPA. You have accepted that the survey information before us now is comprehensive, appropriate and proportionate. You have acceptance the survey material provides a baseline suitable to make a good assessment of the proposals. You also have acceptance that with regard to protected species, the proposed mitigation and enhancements are appropriate, proportionate, and their efficacy is well established. Therefore, there's one issue whether the biodiversity net gain can actually be achieved. But before considering that, it's noteworthy that there's no local policy in the development plan requiring a specific BNG increase. It's also accepted that the provisions of the Environment Act are not yet a requirement. There is really also before the inquiry only one relevant biodiversity net gain exercise, that of Mr. Goodwin. It's also noteworthy when we look at that allegation that only one of the three parts of the exercise is actually challenged. Ms Forster readily accepted the very significant benefits identified for watercourses and hedgerows. The only debate was in relation to the proposed habitat. Ms Forster asked before the commencement of the inquiry for all of the material, including the Excel files from Ecology Solutions, and clearly, having received them, did not seek to do an alternative exercise. None was placed before the inquiry. Mr. Goodwin explained that the exercise that you have before you is precautionary in terms of the classification of the grassland currently and the condition assessment. The bottom line, sir, bringing this all together, is there's no evidence of any kind that the proposal would lead to a negative in biodiversity net gain. There's no exercise of any kind where that was shown. That should be and is actually the end of the matter. Additionally, Ms Forster couldn't put any figure when I asked her repeatedly for what she said the loss would actually be without the full ecological enhancement as proposed by the appellant. There's no evidence you have that the 14.98% gain that Mr Goodwin says will occur in habitat would be wiped out. It was also material that Mr Goodwin did make an assessment and a judgment that even if her concerns were made out, it would reduce the actual total by 1 or 2%. It's also true that the biodiversity net gain metric does not take into account enhancements proposed for protected species like the bats, the great crested newts, the dormice, which would all benefit from the appeal proposals. Therefore, so we say you can conclude there will be a net gain in hedgerows by 52.26%, which was unchallenged and accepted by Ms Forster. The ditches and watercourses by 44.72%, again unchallenged and accepted by Ms Forster. and then the habitats by 14.9%, as articulated by Mr. Goodwin, which was challenged, but absolutely no identification by Kent County Council of what degree there should be a reduction. It's also reflecting, finally, sir, that the only concern relate to some concerns on enhancement measures not being delivered. However, the highest Ms. Forster put her concerns were unlikely or may not, and that's reflected in her proof. The simple point, as Mr. Goodwin articulated, is that what is being proposed is not difficult, it's not ambitious, and we say it's simply not likely to be threatened by the concerns of recreational pressure identified by the LPA. Now, so can I move on to the 10th proposition? I'll take this quickly because it's largely agreed. Also, it's jolly difficult reading. I always think when my colleagues who write 200-page closings, I was amazed at how their voices survive. Anyway, can I go on to para 137, please, sir? We finally have the position of the Section 106 agreement meets their concerns relating to this reason for refusal. That should be the end of the matter. Well, actually, so I do want to just say to Ms. Humphreys and Mr. Morgan, they're probably the unmentioned heroes of this inquiry with the amount of negotiation they've done to get agreement. But I just want to deal with the issue in closing for a moment because of the benefits. There is a complete agreement that there's a need for extra playing pitches within Tenterden and that the proposed development will fulfil that demand. This need not only stems from the need for replacement provision, but significantly from the local need within Tenterden itself. As Mr. Grady showed, there's a relative paucity of sports pitches in Tenterden, and there's a clear and obvious need for more sports pitches from the existing sports teams in Tenterden, particularly evidenced by the fact that Tenterden Tigers, the town's largest football club, cannot play in the town. This clear need to meet existing shortfalls is supported by Sport England, the Town Council Sports Review and the LPA's own playing pitch strategy. Again, matter of common ground is confirmed by Mr. Myatt, who I hope had a nice holiday at the roundtable discussion. Reference has also been made by the LPA to an alleged insufficient information provided by the appellant as to community engagement. Mr. Grady set out what the appellant had done with the sports clubs, which was constructive at first. And indeed, the range of pitches and pavilion were based on the club's own designs, and Mr. Grady produced letters of support. However, clearly there's been an element of local pressure not to engage until after the appeal. And that is epitomised by the Sports Review minutes that we saw, where it was agreed to wait until after the decision has been made before inquiring about the pitches on the appeal side. If these facilities, sports facilities, are built, they will be used. There can be no reasonable doubt on this issue, we say. And so can I just make as an aside, I spent many years doing work for Tesco, and I once asked how many Tesco stores that had been heavily objected to actually ended up closing because people didn't shop in them. And I was told none. So obviously people's perspective about development is very different before it becomes a reality and after it becomes a reality. Then returning to the text, sir, the appellant agrees that there should be a governance strategy for the delivery and management of the facilities. And we say this has been provided in very sufficient detail. As Mr. Grady explained, Sports England confirmed that these are an appropriate level of detail for this stage. As to management, again, I'll take this quickly because the LPA have effectively, I think, now been satisfied on this point. It's also the position that the LPA now say that the 106 provides a clear framework for the appointment of an operator moving forward, appropriate triggers, and there's also a clear need in the sports facilities in the local area. And we say there is no reasonable prospect that the facilities will not be used. Consequently, the policies now comply with the requirements of policy IMP4, and we say there's no legitimate objection to the proposals on this basis. Moreover, the level of benefits that the appeal scheme will secure for sports provision is significant. So now dealing with the 11th proposition, AB70, and I will try not to use all my hanger at 12:58 towards this point, but we simply say, sir, the very straightforward position is that this is not a material consideration for you. It is noteworthy, not one case of law or any appeal decision has been produced by the LPA where anyone has said it should be. What is the legal basis for the contention that this is a material consideration and we say there's none? Where is there one appeal decision where an inspector has faced the same question you had to address, who has endorsed the allegation of harm relating to an outline scheme and its effect on a proposed footpath which has outstanding objections to its confirmation by a very well-resourced and determined objector? Where is there the policy in national guidance, in the MPPF or the PPG, where such a position is stated? Where's there any policy in the development plan where it said potential public rights of way should be material considerations? Nowhere. Where's there any policy in an SPD saying that either? Or in any officer's report, apart from this one, where the authority have taken a comparative approach? The answer, sir, to every question is, of course, a negative. This reason of refusal is promoted in a complete vacuum of legal and policy support because there frankly is none. To give weight to this in the planning balance would be without justification in law and practice. Whether that footpath will be confirmed will be determined by a public inquiry due to take place in April 2022. And it is the appellant's strong contention that the footpath will not be confirmed. However, of course, regardless of the likelihood or otherwise of the footpath being made, the simple fact is it hasn't been confirmed at today's date and will probably not be at the date of your decision based on the expected timetables. It is currently non-existent. It follows that whether or not the proposed development will have an effect on it is not a relevant matter for you to take into account at this stage. Crucially, Ms Goodyear agreed that policy TRA5 only bites where there's an actual public right of way, which of course AB 70 is not. Ms Goodyear also agreed that policy TRA5 cannot apply at this point of time. On that basis, in reality, the LPA has given up the substance for this reason of refusal. In any event, even if it were a relevant matter to take into account, which it's not, it does not give rise to any reason to refuse permission. There is, of course, the common ground that Ms Beswick from Kent County Council agreed at the roundtable session that if permission was granted, this will not prevent AB 70 from being confirmed at a rights of way inquiry in the future. She also confirmed if permission is granted for the appeal scheme and AB 70 is confirmed, the route can be accommodated within the appeal scheme and will not be obstructed. If a diversion is preferred, Ms Beswick agreed that it would be possible to divert the route to accommodate it in the western part of the appeal site. Mr Ross also confirmed that the appellant would be more than willing to engage in this separate application to divert the route in discussions with Kent if this becomes necessary. This was exactly the approach endorsed with Tent 1A. It transpires, however, that the concern is an extremely narrow one, namely the proposed alignment shown by Appendix G of Mr Ross's proof would not be a sufficiently satisfactory route. It's effectively a qualitative point. Mr Marshall explained that the alignment would provide a safe environment, the potential routing through a proposed country park car park not unusual, low speed environment and consistent with the scenarios common to such facilities elsewhere in Tenterden and the borough. It would also provide new opportunities for journeys by foot in accordance with policy TR5, certainly not discourage journeys on foot. Mr Smith also addressed the experience of using it. His evidence demonstrated that the western end, the existing settlement end, is already a notable element in the majority of views. The relevant residential development would provide attractive views along the greenways as well as long views towards St Mildred's. There would be positive changes to views at the eastern end of the site within the new country park. Further, in any event, as Mr Ross explained, the residential part of the scheme is in outline. The confirmation of AB 70 can be dealt with as a matter of detail at reserved matters. In addition, as mentioned above, Ms Beswick confirmed that if AB 70 is made, it will be possible to accommodate the route with a diversion to the western part of the appeal site. So therefore, sir, bring it together. We say there's no breach of policy, there's no substantive objection. Primarily, the unmade footpath is not a material consideration. Alternatively, even if relevant, it is possible to accommodate the footpath within the site, either on its proposed alignment or with a diversion if that is preferred. Then lastly, in terms of the substance, can I deal with the third parties? We've obviously had other matters which are not in dispute with the LPA, but they have been dealt with by the third parties, and we say those matters have been comprehensively and diligently addressed. In terms of heritage, Ms. Stotton gave you evidence on a thorough analysis of the designated heritage assets in the surrounding area. She found there would be no harm through changes in setting. That's in line with the position of the LPA and Historic England. She was also fully satisfied that the site of the gallows of particular concern to Mr. Poole was outside of the appeal site. This is a conclusion agreed by 4 experts, Dr. Cook, Mr. Hawkins from RPS and the officer at KCC. Ms. Stotton overall explained there'd be no overall harm to the heritage significance of archaeological remains or historic landscape features. Mr. Marshall then dealt with concerns about transport on highways and again agreed with Kent. The local network will be able to safely accommodate increases generated and where necessary appropriate mitigation measures have been agreed. Then in terms of sustainability and accessibility, Mr. Marshall demonstrated the appeal site is located in a highly sustainable location, which does provide genuine and realistic opportunities to travel by modes of transport other than the private car. This reflects Tenterden's role as a principal rural service centre and as the second most sustainable settlement in the borough. The site is well located to encourage future residents to use public transport facilities, which will be further improved by way of additional bus infrastructure. This is fully in accordance with national and local planning policy on these issues. It's also noteworthy there's no allegation from Kent that this is an unsustainable location as set out in the overarching statement of common ground, and no allegation from the LPA the site's not in a sustainable location. And again, compliance and acceptance from Ms. Goodyear of HOU 5, that should of course be A, B and C. Finally, sir, dealing with drainage and flood risk, a full FRA has been provided and the LPA is satisfied that reason of refusal 7 has been addressed. Mr. Maynard explained that the appeal scheme, which includes the SUDS features, together with appropriate conditions, will safely manage surface water runoff, and there will be no greater flood risk both on the site and in the surrounding area. Again, complete compliance with the policy on this area. So can I deal with the final proposition? And we say very strongly the proposal is in accordance with the development plan and material considerations further indicate permission should be granted. We say all the evidence shows overall the proposals are in compliance with the development plan. Of course, and you'll know this was a theme I developed with Miss Goodyear in cross-examination, we say she did not carry out a proper assessment, not considering the development plan as a whole, including the policies that even on her evidence were complied with. Her exercise was materially deficient and consequently worthless. It is axiomatic that on any balance, if you only consider and weigh harm, there can only be one conclusion, of course. However, that approach was even more remarkable when she readily accepted there were 24 policies which supported the grant of consent or were not breached, and yet their place in her balance were completely ignored. It summed up the partial approach throughout her evidence, which was to ignore anything which might be of benefit or in the appellant's favour. As explained by Mr. Ross in his evidence, the decision in accordance with the development plan, when considered as a whole, is to grant permission. The material considerations further support the grant of consent. In particular, the operation of the tilted balance is overwhelmingly in favour of the scheme. The minor harms relied on by the LPA come nowhere close to significantly and demonstrably outweighing the substantial and weighty benefits of the appeal scheme. So, sir, finally, we do ask you to allow the appeal and therefore literally transform materially the lives of many and give them a home. 141 families, couples, individuals, children, give them a home for many years in which they can enjoy, and therefore we ask to grant permission. And we say after 12 days of public inquiry and the consequent scrutiny, that it would be an outcome that would be completely justified. And therefore, we commend in the strongest terms the proposal to you. And so those are the closing submissions on behalf of the appellant in this matter. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. White. So that basically concludes the evidence at this inquiry now. Sorry, Mr. Howell Williams, you've got your hand up.
Yes, sir. It's just one discrete point arising from Mr. White's closing submission. So it's not my practice to dispute questions of evidence that you will have a note on. And I don't do that. Of course, there are matters between us. That's self-evident that you will have your notes. But there's one point of confirmation and clarification that I think I need to make clear to assist you. It's at paragraph 113.
Paragraph 113, I'll just go back to that. 113, yes?
Yes, it's in the context of T381, the ancient tree, and paragraph 180C in the tilted balance.
Yes.
And the only point is this. Mr. White is correct to say that Mr. Ross, in his oral evidence in chief, made the point that the council had not asserted that the tilted balance was triggered by paragraph 180C. Mr. Ross was correct in that, and which is why there was no need to cross-examine him. However, unless you are not careful or don't have a proper note of his evidence in chief, you might be misled unintentionally by the reference in 113 in the last line and in half of the footnote to Mr. Ross' comment being that there was no allegation that paragraph 180C was engaged, which is not the same point as 180C engaging the tilted balance. The latter point is correct. However, the council has asserted in reason for refusal number 4 that 180C is engaged and indeed breached. And Mr. Cook's proof of evidence gives evidence on that, and in particular his conclusion indeed that that paragraph, that policy is breached. You will see that, sir. So that's the...
So you're saying that that would then go towards the tilted balance?
No, I haven't. The council has not asserted that paragraph 11 Roman 1 is engaged so as to prevent the tilted balance. That's a decision that the council made, but it doesn't follow from that there isn't a breach of paragraph 180.
Right, okay, yes, I can see what you're saying. Anything that Mr. White wants to say on that, or?
Well, sir, only to note, it's completely bizarre. I mean, you cannot contend 180. If you look at the terms, it's completely inconsistent what Mr. Howell Williams is saying, the council's position, that 180C is engaged and breached, but the tilted balance in some way is not disengaged. Because as you recall, his note, what he says in closing is there will be loss of T381. That then, if you look at the footnote, little 7 talks about irreplaceable habitats. And then when you look at 180C, development resulting in the loss of irreplaceable habitats. So he wants, well, he doesn't even want his cake and eat it. It's completely inconsistent to say, as he does in closing, there will be a loss of irreplaceable habitat. That in terms in footnote 7 disengages the tilted balance. But he says to you in this unique case that it is not the council's case. I mean, it's just not, there's a complete inconsistency, frankly, on what the MPPF says, hence why I drew attention to it in 113. And frankly, rather than clearing matters up, this intervention, which of course, as Mr. Howell Williams says, is incredibly unconventional and rare to seek to come back after your opponent has finished, it's completely bizarre. And I haven't got a clue what the council's case is on this point.
Right, thank you for both of those. I'll consider that then in my decision. Anything that anyone wants to raise before I conclude? Well, thank you very much for sticking to the timetable as best you can and helping with everything at this inquiry. I know it's been a few difficult moments when we've lost touch and everything for various reasons, being a virtual inquiry. But I feel that I've managed to take on board the evidence that people wanted to present, and that people have actually been able to take part, albeit in writing, rather than coming forward to present their evidence. But I feel as though I've taken on board all the evidence that people have wished to put forward. So I'm happy that I've heard all the evidence that I need to make my decision. So thank you very much for helping and cooperating with that. So unless there's anything else, apart from just reminding people about this section 106 that I'm expecting to receive it in 2 weeks' time, it just leaves me to close this inquiry. So the inquiry is now closed.